Yep, it's on. Okay. Well, I'm delighted to be here. Actually, I spoke in this very auditorium on a different occasion. I'm thinking 3 years ago, so it's nice to be back home. I greatly appreciate your giving me the time to speak to you. And I'm very glad. I want to talk about slides. I'm not a slide person. And I'm delighted to see you have copies, because these are very hard slides to see. Secondly, I want to make clear that the slides were put together for you, not while I'm speaking so much, but rather if you hear something tonight that interests you, you can look on the slides and remind yourself what it was that you heard. It did interest you. So I just want to be clear about how they're going to be used. My agenda for tonight, you know, this is a special group, and I'm going to take advantage of it. You are analysts, you're finance people, and that mixed things. So I wanted to talk first tonight a little bit about our field, or broadly the field of finance, in particular finance as a science. Why? Because we're in this field. The science of finance, modern finance, has for almost 50 years had a profound impact on the development of financial systems around the world, and has done a great deal to improve societies around the world. And I just thought we ought to kind of look a little bit at our history, at least once. But I'm also going to use that to relate to things such as this is the 10th anniversary of the great financial crisis. And as you can see, finance science and finance innovation was in the title. You may recall that at least at the initial parts of the crisis, the statements were that it was financial innovation and so forth that was the cause of the crisis. I just came from a big event in New York with all of the central bankers who were the central bankers at the time of the crisis. So Bernanke, King, Trichet, and so forth. And in a retrospect, I can report to you that it seems the consensus is that the crisis was an old-fashioned bank run. But that big shock and surprise that in 2008 you could have a bank run on the system. We didn't think that you could have those anymore. And things like subprime and so forth, those narratives turned out not to have been a very important part. They were a factor, but not important. So I'm reporting that to you. But in that spirit, I wanted to talk a little bit about how science has interacted with innovation, and innovation in turn improves society. That's my first part. Then we have a second topic, which has been a perennial one here, but we've had it around the world, and that is, what do we do in a low interest rate environment? So I'm going to talk a little bit about this. I'm going to tell you right now, I have no magic. I can't wave a wand and somehow give us high returns with no risk to make up for the low returns. But I will have some things and ideas to perhaps share with you and maybe stimulate it. The last thing I want to talk about, before my time's up, is not on your list. And that is, I want to talk about AI, fintech, the future innovations coming there, because this, of course, is a very big topic around the world. Every central bank, and plus the IMF, are studying this and so forth. And I thought it might be useful, because I've been, to give you some thoughts about that. So that's my agenda for you this evening. That's the roadmap. You ready to start? Okay.
Okay, Professor,
So,
could you give me a chance
yes.
to summarize? 一橋大学本田でございます。よろしくお願いいたします。貴重なお時間ですので、私はあんまり邪魔しないようにしますけれども、今日のお話、かいつまんで解説というお役回りですので、よろしくお願いいたします。今日はですね、最初が、あれですね、ファイナンスサイエンスというふうに、資料の中にもありますけれども、ちょうど2008年のグローバルフィナンシャルクライシスから10年経ったところで、ファイナンスの学術研究がどのように社会に貢献してきたのかというところをお話しするというのが最初のトピックです。で、2つ目のトピックが、皆さんもよくご存知のように、日本は非常に低金利の時間が長くなってきている中で、どのように対処して考えていけばいいのかというのを2つ目のトピックにして、3つ目のタイトルは、冒頭で先生おっしゃられてましたけれども、そのスライドあんまり使わないようなで自由にお話しいただく方なんですが、このスライドには載ってませんけれども、AI であるとかフィンテック、非常にいろんな話題になっておりますけれども、それが今後ファイナンスの世界にどういうふうに影響していくかということに関して、先生がどういうふうにお考えになっているかということをお話ししたいということです。
Thank you. So, finance is a science, and it is a science. I could just simply say there have been 8 Nobel Prizes in economics. The work was associated with finance. That might be approved. But more importantly, what is a science? It has principles, hypotheses, it has data. The data are used to confront those hypotheses in a systematic way. Finance wasn't always a science. Prior to, I would say, the 1950s, it was a collection of anecdotes, accounting identities, rules of thumb, but not a science, and it had no data. You're a young group, but in 1950s, even, there were no stock market data. All they had was the Dow Jones average. There was no data in stocks, the materials that you rely on to do everything. None of that existed. So there was no data. So just, well, you might want
to. 最初ですけど、3ページのところに、先ほどはノーベル経済学賞の中で8回ですね、ファイナンスに関係した受賞者がいるということでしたけれども、3ページ見ていただくと非常に重要な貢献をなさった方々のまとめになっております。
So, I date the beginning of finance becoming a science with the work of Harry Markowitz on portfolio theory, in which he developed an analytical model for diversification. I remind you, because it's on this, we'll go through it, there are 3 ways to manage risk, but there are only 3 ways to manage risk. Diversification, hedging, and I mean by hedging, replacing a risky asset with a risk-free asset, getting rid of both upside and downside risk. That's hedging. And insurance. Insurance, you pay a premium for the protection, but you then have the upside. Those are the only 3. And combinations of that are how all risk management is done. Markowitz did diversification, followed by the work of Kenneth Arrow, who showed us what securities markets can do and not do. We had then Jim Tobin brought in hedging, the risk-free asset, to diversification. We had Moniani Miller in corporate finance, transformed corporate finance, the way we look at it, and still look at it today. And then in the 1960s, the University of Chicago developed the first comprehensive database of securities going back to the 1920s all the way through to the 1960s on every stock that traded in the United States. And those data transformed how the field worked, because now we could confront ideas, thoughts, hypotheses, stories with the actual data to see whether it's supported or not.
Okay, just go ahead.
Want to keep going?
Yes,
Okay.
please.
I put up there the CFA charting. CFA was around a little longer, but the CFA developed examinations and curriculum. I think that's a very important statement because it said that there was enough been developed in a formal fashion and enough data around so that you could put together a comprehensive program of what you have to know and how to do it and test it. So I take this as an important piece of evidence in support of finance becoming an organized, efficient. The efficient markets hypothesis, Gene Fama, Paul Samuelson, which is a cornerstone of understanding where risk comes from and what risk you're rewarded for, partly came from the data. The first thing they did with the data was to ask, what did an average stock do over those 40 years? So just look at all the stocks and just figure out for each one how they did. You know what the number was that they found for the average stock? 9.3% return. That was a shock. No trust departments made 9.3%. And this was just from randomly taking a stock. So that's how data started to change the way we look at the world. Beyond that, and this was the capital asset pricing model of Bill Sharp, what did that tell us? It said the expected return on all stocks is not the same. Even in a world where everything's priced correctly. Why? Because they had different risks. And in equilibrium, if you have higher risk measured properly, you should have higher reward. That was very important for the trust departments because now you could say, it's true, they didn't earn 9.23%, but they took less risk than a typical stock would be if you put all your money in it. And therefore the CAPM said, don't say the trust departments aren't doing a good job or you can't tell because they took a different amount of risk and therefore you would expect the return to be the same. I'm not going to run through all of these. And then we went on and tested it. So by the end of the 1960s, finance had developed into a science. And now we're going to move to the next phase.
3ページのところは非常に有名な先生方の研究が紹介されてますし、今の話もそういう紹介になっておりますけれども、ちょっと特徴的なところは1952年から始まって、1960年から63年のところにシカゴセンター・フォー・リサーチ・イン・セキュリティ・プライス、要するにデータが整備されたのがこの頃だということですね。それから CFA ですね、プロフェッショナルの投資家たちがどういう役割を果たしたかということで、1962年、63年というところで CFA にも触れられております。結局52年から65年、70年に向かって非常に大きな発展があって、この時期にファイナンスという分野がいわゆる科学、サイエンスになったというふうなお話でございました。
So, as I mentioned, the Great Crisis is its 10th anniversary. The response around the world was to cut back on innovation, slow everything down. I'm not saying that was the wrong thing to do. I'm not here to evaluate it. But I do want to say that's not the norm. It isn't always true when you have a crisis that the response is to slow down innovation. And to show you that, I'm going to go to another very important big financial crisis in the 1970s. And I put up a list of the shocks to the financial system, starting in the United States, but then permeating throughout the world, that occurred in the 70s And I'll just list them in no particular order. Bretton Woods ended. What does that mean? For a generation, currencies were fixed. Nobody had to think about currencies. Nobody knew what the exchange rate was because you didn't care. It was always the same. Suddenly, all those risks, whether it's international trade, holding foreign assets, whatever, all that became very risky as a shock. Not even thought about for a generation. What else happened? Well, we had the oil crisis. Oil went from $250 US a barrel to about $13. Big disruption, big impact on society, big impact on automobiles. I mean, and we didn't know we had the number, but by the end of the decade, we had a second one. So that's it. What else do we have in the United States? And this is really for the younger, I can see you all there, okay? The younger people in the audience. We had in the United States 10% inflation. Now, most of the time, we seem to be almost worrying more about deflation, but 10% inflation. Now, we hadn't seen that in the United States since the middle of the 19th century, our Civil War. That was 100 years before. Nobody alive had experienced that. Big shock. What else did we have? We had, with high inflation, high unemployment. This last crisis, unemployment got up very high, 9–10% in the United States. This was 9%, but we didn't have 10% inflation. You put the two of those together, the central banks, including Bank of Japan, but the ECB, the Fed, could not have done the policies that they did do this crisis had they been sitting in a 10% inflation environment. So this is called stagflation, very big risk, and nobody still really knows quite how to do with it. The stock market dropped, and interest rates, because of inflation, were also double-digit, over 10%. And by the end of the decade, and into the 1980s, treasuries, short-term treasuries, were 21%. 21% on U.S. treasuries. Okay? All of this happened, and then there was no money for housing because we had a rule. Banks couldn't pay more than 5%. Now, you don't have to be particularly sophisticated in finance, that if you have a choice of getting 10% interest, full faith and credit of the government, or 5% from a bank, which would you pick? And there was just no money. So housing completely trashed. So these were a series of very large shocks. But now, what was the response of that? Was it cutting in? No. We had an explosion of financial innovation.
今度4ページのところですけれども、2008年のフィナンシャルクライシスというのは我々の記憶の中でも新しいですけれども、1970年代を思い出してみると非常に大きなショックがありましたというのが4ページにあります。時間ありませんけれども、為替のブレットンウッズから始まって原油価格のクライシスですか、インフレーションも 20% を超えるとか、失業率が 9% を超えるといったスタグフレーションの状況になって、株式市場も暴落しますし、金利も 10%、20% を超えるレートになるというようなことがあると。そうすると、銀行に対する規制のところからモーゲージの住宅ローンも出てこないと、そういったような状況になってきたのが1970年代で、こういった時期にじゃあ何が起きたのかと、ファイナンスサイエンスはどういうふうに貢献したのかというところでお話になると思います。
I'm not going to go through each of these, but again, depending on what vintage you are, everybody looks young to me, okay? But many of these markets and things, have been a part of your professional life, your whole professional life. They didn't exist before. They were created this time. We created the first options market. That's an insurance market, financial insurance. We created futures contracts in currencies, equities, fixed income interest rates. Remember, Imagine what it would be like to borrow money to do a real estate project if interest rates could move 400 or 500 basis points as risk. So they wanted to lock in those risks. We had the first electronic stock exchange. We had money market funds were created, index investing, huge trillion-dollar investing strategies, all were created at this time. In the U.S., if we have our, what we'll call 401ks, our personal retirement, advice, standard advice to everyone is in the equity part of their investments. Diversify all over the whole world. Don't just buy U.S. stocks, buy around the world. That wasn't done at all, even by institutions, until the 1970s. That's when that happened. We had commissions fixed so that if you were an institution and you were buying 100,000 shares, and I'm an individual and I'm buying 100 shares, you, the institution, would pay 1,000 times the commission that I paid. In other words, no break. Well, you could see that doesn't help the development of institutionalization. We got rid of that, and that began what we see, of course, today, the institutionalization of the stock market that is dominated by institutions, not individuals, and so forth. All right? Then debt securitization, national mortgage market. Remember I said there was no money for housing, and it just shut down in the U.S. So instead of depending on local banks as we did, we created a national mortgage market, which means we could access funds to fund residential mortgages in the United States from the whole world. From here in Japan, people in Japan, institutions could buy our mortgages and fund our housing. And I can say, you want
Go ahead.
okay. And I can say, in the 40 years since the market was created, there's never been a time in the United States when there was no mortgage money. You know, the price goes up, it goes down for interest rates. Credit a little more, a little tight, a little less. But there's always money for mortgages. It was not that way. It disappeared periodically. So this was an innovation that not only dealt with the risks of the time, but continues to pay society dividends for decades since. And that's the nature of most of these innovations. They didn't only address the risks of the time, which is what they were inspired to do, but they actually continue to add value to society for the reasons we did. I have to mention one other. The interest rate swap. Very simple contract to understand. You just exchange a floating interest rate for a fixed one. Now, not simple to do a scale of 600 trillion US dollars at low cost and efficiently. That's operationally difficult, but easy to understand. What did that do? It forever took probably was the biggest risk in banks, certainly banks in the US, where they had depositors who wanted to get their money anytime, so you had to give them short term. And you had business people, real estate people, people buying mortgages who want a fixed rate because of all the interest rate fluctuation. And by accommodating the two customers, what happened to the bank? The bank's cost of money was floating up and down with interest rate. The bank's revenue was fixed. So when interest rates went up, what would happen to the bank? They all became insolvent. And it was only the intervention of government, essentially allowing them to stay until things calmed down, that kept that from happening. The interest rate swap has eliminated that forever. Any bank today can have any interest rate exposure it wants without disturbing its customers. It can swap fixed for floating and get rid of all of that maturity risk. Pretty cool. So what did I show you? What's the message from all of this? The message is we had an enormous wave of innovation that transformed first the US financial economy, but if you look around, including in Japan and just about every country, even developing countries, these markets and these innovations have been voluntarily adopted in what I think is pretty strong evidence that at least the collective belief is these have been good innovations. Okay?
はい、5ページのところでは、先ほどの1970年代のさまざまなクライシスに対応して、オプションから始まって、いろんな、今日ではもう当たり前のことになってますけれども、証券化も始まりました、金利のスワップも始まりました、グローバルの分散投資も始まりましたというご指摘です。これは危機をきっかけにこういうさまざまなイノベーションが起きて、かつ今最後に強調なさってたのは、このイノベーションがまずアメリカの金融市場で行われて、それが日本をはじめ世界各国に広がっていったというのが一つ非常に良い大きなイノベーションだったということの証拠になっているだろうというご指摘です。
Now, coming back to the science, what went along with all this innovation, huge innovation, I mean, it transformed financial services and the whole industry. By the way, looking at a little bit of history is not a bad thing to do if later on you're going to talk about what the future is going to be in innovation, AI, fintech. So there's double duty here. What happened was these innovations, the options market, the mortgage market, all of these could not have been done without finance science. The models, there's no way you could do those in your head. No one had any experience even in trading options at all. It was a one-sided market. They had no experience, let alone models. And mortgages have many important options in them, so you couldn't do the mortgage market without that. So finance science, sophisticated models, lots of data, statistical tools to analyze it, and computers. You know, not like today, but mainframe computers, big databases. You've heard big data. Well, it was big data then too, just on a different scale. That was an essential part. And at this time, what happened? Finance practice, mainstream finance practice, became inexorably connected with finance science, academic research, and the people that in the industry do the research. That's why finance today is still that way. Of all the branches of economics, finance is the one where the models and the data are most directly used, even though they're very sophisticated, in mainline finance practice. And I believe this is where it started. Okay, so that's how the two came together. The reaction of big shocks to the system was quite the opposite of the more recent experience, an explosion of innovation to respond to all the new risks, and that the long-run benefit from these innovations have been serving society, not just the US society, but societies around the world since that time.
今までのところ少し70年代に起きた大きな危機に対していろいろなイノベーションが起きたわけですけど、そのイノベーションの下支えになっていたのが実はファイナンスサイエンスということで、6ページのところに70年代に起きた非常に大きな重要な学術的なごめんなさい6ページですね、学術的な貢献の代表的な論文とモデルであるとか紹介されてあります。先生のお話の中ではモデルが重要ですし、それからその時にデータが非常に重要になってきた、データ分析が重要になってきて、かつそれを実行する上でのコンピューターの発達というのもあったんだということをおっしゃっています。Yes, please.
Now, it's a treat for me every time I come here to Japan to pay respect to Professor Kiyoshi Ito. His mathematics, he was a professor at Kyoto. His mathematics, the Ito stochastic calculus, was a young 20-something, well, younger than I am now, 20-something-year-old was looking for a mathematics to solve a problem. And I had a lot of math, but I found it, and it was Professor Ito's calculus. And there were a lot of competitors. There were Russians, Stratanovich, they had there, so he had competitors. But Professor Ito's mathematics turned out to be just right. And so his mathematics has been at the foundation of much of modern finance and certainly much of the developments that I called through. So I tip my hat once again to that enormous contribution. And okay. So this completes my remarks on taking you through finance science, through huge innovations that have profound impacts on societies around the world. And now we're going to change topics to the question or issue surrounding the challenge of low interest rates.
7ページのところに伊藤清先生のお写真が載っておりますけれども、マートン先生が若かりし頃にですね、非常に重要な大きな仕事をいくつもやられたんですね。その問題を設定して、どうやってこうやってモデルを作って解いていったらいいのかっていうのを一生懸命探していったときに、伊藤清先生が考え出したといいますか、数学的な定理なんですけれども、その技術が非常に有効に使えるということが分かって、で実際にそのマートン先生をはじめとして多くの方々は伊藤先生の功績のもとでですね、確率的なランダムに動くような事象に対してどういうふうに行動していけばいいのかという理論が1970年代に非常に大きく発展したということであります。